We are excited to welcome Dr. Dawn Wilkins, who is coming to us from Martin, Tennessee. She's a professor at the University of Tennessee at Martin. I'm ready to go ahead and end this polling and get this show on the road. Oh, good question, Carol Ann. Warner Park is not a state park. We are a city park. I am a Metro Parks employee, and we also have some other people joining us, and I'll get into that right now. I want to end our polling and share our results. Don, it looks like most people are familiar with woodpeckers communicating to each other, or maybe communicating with us. That's what it feels like sometimes. Excuse me, my name is Heather Gallagher. I'm coming to you from Warner Park Nature Center in Nashville, Tennessee. This program is a Find Your Inner Naturalist webinar made possible by a strong partnership between Friends of Warner Parks, our nonprofit, and they are giving us this platform of Zoom tonight, Metro Parks of Nashville, Davidson County, and Warner Park Nature Center. If you're interested in learning more about Warner Park Nature Center and our programs, please check us out at wpnc.nashville.gov. That's our website. And if you're interested, by the way, in more of the bird research going on here at Warner Park, you can also go to that website and then click on the bird program. We have research taking place here at the Nature Center, over 17 bird-related research projects since 1935. So lots going on here. If you've never been on a Zoom webinar, sorry guys, I have to do this. It's called the Zoom rules. If you've never been on a webinar, I just want to kind of let you know how this is going to work. You can see whoever is actively speaking, and so that might be me, Heather Gallagher, or it might be our presenter, Dawn Wilkins. If you are having trouble seeing us, Laura Cook, hi Laura, is running tech for us tonight. You can call the Nature Center. You can email the Nature Center at wpnc@nashville.gov, and she can send you a link. If you happen to get knocked off of this webinar, no problem. Just close everything down and go right back in using the link that I sent you. I'm so excited to welcome you here tonight. We have many great programs coming up, and our entire program schedule is available to you on our website. Again, that's wpnc.nashville.gov. I'm excited now to introduce our speaker. Dr. Dawn Wilkins is an avian ecologist interested primarily in the ecology and behaviors of woodpeckers. She earned her BS in Natural Resources Management with a concentration in wildlife biology from the University of Tennessee at Martin. Just so you know, not the same UT that beat Kentucky. Dr. Wilkins studied communication in red-bellied woodpeckers to earn her MS in biological sciences with a concentration in applied ecology from Eastern Kentucky University, not the same Kentucky that lost the other night. To earn her PhD in biological sciences from Mississippi State University, she studied the winter ecology of yellow-bellied sapsuckers. How exciting! Dr. Wilkins currently teaches courses in ornithology, animal ecology, and conservation biology at the University of Tennessee at Martin. Dawn, we've been looking forward to this. For the rest of you, if you have questions, please type them in the chat or in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and I will share them as appropriate with Dr. Wilkins. Thank you so much for being here tonight, Dawn.
Thanks for having me. I always enjoy talking about woodpeckers, and I can't believe you have such a large audience. This will be great. Feel free to ask any questions along the way. Heather will help you with that, I guess, because it'll be distracting for me to try to read them at the same time. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about woodpeckers to get us started. The first question I often get is, why do you like woodpeckers so much? And I don't know that it's a really easy question to answer other than they make me happy. They're pretty, they're bright, they're colorful, they're loud and boisterous. And so maybe as you hear me talk about them tonight, you can figure out what it is that makes them so special. All right. And so woodpeckers belong to something called the Bart Foraging Guild. And that refers to the organisms that can run up and down the trunk of the tree and feed along the way. And they can feed in various different ways. That's going to include among the birds things like nuthatches, black and white warblers, brown creepers, along with the woodpeckers. But you'll notice that that list isn't very long, at least until you get to the woodpeckers, and there's lots of different species of them. So most birds aren't able to take advantage of this particular resource, because in order to do that, you have to have some special adaptations. And so one of the adaptations that you see in woodpeckers is they have feet that are a little bit different from some of the other birds. So the other birds that I mentioned, even on the previous slide, the nuthatches, the creepers, the warblers, and most of your songbirds that you would be familiar with, they have what's referred to as an anisodactyl foot, which means they have 3 toes that point forward and 1 toe, which is the big toe, that points backwards. Woodpeckers have what's referred to as a zygodactyl foot, which means they have 2 toes that are facing forwards and 2 toes that hang back. And one of the toes that hangs back can move up to the side to help them better grip and hold onto the tree as they're going up and down. As woodpeckers are climbing up and down the tree, they have 3 points of contact: their 2 feet and their tail. Their tail feathers are usually going to be mostly black in color because they're reinforced with a pigment called melanin. And that melanin pigment is really neat because it doesn't degrade very easily, and it even resists bacteria trying to break it down. And so if you find an old woodpecker feather that had white splotches on it, and then the dark feather itself, a lot of times the white part will erode away, and you'll just have the black part of the feather left behind. And so the fact that they have the black on their tail feathers isn't an accident. Their feathers are also pointy, like you can see in the picture here, that allows them to grip better onto the tree trunk. So earlier, a lot of you said you'd heard them communicating, and I think that is one of the reasons I like them so much, because they are very vocal all year long, not just during the springtime when they're breeding. And so they really use 2 types of communication. They have your typical vocal communication where they'll give different types of songs and calls, but they also will drum on trees. That is, they'll rhythmically bang their bill against a resonant surface, anything that makes good noise. So a hollow tree, your gutter, whatever happens to be very, very loud. And they use this drumming much the same way other birds use other types of communication. So to attract mates, to announce where their territory is, and that type of thing. So if you do have a woodpecker banging on your gutter in the spring, if you just give them a couple of weeks until they find a mate, they'll probably just stop on their own. The picture on this slide is actually from my master's research, and it's showing you a sonogram or a picture of what it looks like when you run the woodpecker drum through. You can see the individual hits is what you're seeing on these pictures of a red-bellied woodpecker drum. All right, woodpecker tongues are also special. They can extend far beyond their head, and they have very good dexterity so that they can thread it amongst grooves that they might run into in the tree. They have a hard tip on the end, and a lot of times that tip will have spikes or spines associated with it. So if you look at the picture of the tongue, the close-up of the tongue, you can see those little spines sticking off of it, and you'll notice that they kind of fold backwards so that when they push their tongue into an invertebrate, it's going to slip easily into the invertebrate, but then when they pull the tongue back towards their mouth, those spikes get hung, and it helps to wiggle the invertebrate free from crevices that they're foraging in. Not all woodpeckers have spines like this. Some of them, like yellow-bellied sapsuckers, have a brushy tongue that helps them to lap up sap from sap wells, which we'll talk about more later. Another weird thing about woodpecker tongues is that they can extend very far past their bill, especially compared to other birds. And the reason it can do that is because of a V-shaped cartilage called the hyoid. And for woodpeckers, the hyoid can, in some cases, wrap all the way around the skull, helping them to extend their tongue even further. So the picture on this slide is a northern flicker. And northern flickers have the longest tongue of the woodpeckers that we have in Tennessee, or they can extend it past their bill the longest. And they need to be able to do this because they thread their tongue into ant mounds following ants so that they can grab them out of the ground. So in Tennessee, we have 7 species of woodpeckers that are still around and 2 species that are extinct from the state. The ivory-billed woodpecker would have historically been in some of the bottomlands closer to the Mississippi River, and the red-cockaded woodpecker would have been in some of the evergreen types of coniferous types of forests that we have in the Smoky Mountains, but neither one of them live in Tennessee anymore. The ivory-billed woodpecker is likely extinct. The red-cockaded woodpecker, however, has been expanding its range in the southeast and is doing a little bit better. It just doesn't occur in Tennessee. Of the woodpeckers that occur in Tennessee, the yellow-bellied sapsucker is migratory, and so you're only going to see those during the winter time. And the rest of them you can see year-round if you know where they're hanging out. All right, so I work at an undergraduate institution, so we don't have graduate students. And so all the projects that I do have to be in little bite-sized chunks that undergraduate students can understand and handle and work with. And through the years, we have worked on lots of different things, not just woodpeckers. We've worked with herons and egrets, barred owls, osprey, all kinds of different things. And as I go through the 3 projects I'm going to highlight tonight, you'll see that we've worked on little pieces and they lead to big ideas. And so the first project I'm going to talk about is going to be about cavity succession.
Hey, Dawn, we have a question from Melissa. She says, does the flicker experience the fire ants stinging when it's feeding on them?
I don't know specifically about fire ants, but ants are a difficult thing to eat anyway because of the formic acid that's associated with them. And the formic acid the ants have does not seem to bother the woodpeckers at all. But I'm not exactly sure about the fire ants. Okay. So as we get started talking about this project, what I'm going to do for each one of these is kind of give you something to think about as we're talking about each one. And for this one, I'm wondering how many different things can you think of that live in cavities, and not thinking about woodpeckers? What other types of things live in cavities? Woodpeckers are what are known as primary cavity excavators. And what that means is they can go up to a tree and using their chisel-shaped bill, they can excavate and form a cavity within it. They use that cavity for nesting and roosting. And the cavity is going to provide a lot of protection from predators and from harsh environmental conditions. And so if it's raining out, they can go and they can huddle in their cavity. The cavity in this picture is a red-cockaded woodpecker cavity. And they are a little bit different from our other woodpeckers because they excavate their cavities into living trees rather than dead trees. Secondary cavity nesters include things like tufted titmice, Carolina chickadees, which is the little bird in the picture on the bottom there, amongst other birds. Carolina wrens will do it, nuthatches, eastern bluebirds, things like that. And they are dependent upon either naturally formed cavities or cavities formed by woodpeckers. Naturally formed cavities are where you've had maybe a branch break off that forms a little soft spot in the tree that gets a little rod in it and forms a cavity, for example. And they're going to happen at somewhat, not necessarily random, but they're not going to be at a location that the bird would necessarily choose. Whereas woodpeckers are able to choose where they put their cavity. So if you have a tree that's on a slope that's good for a cavity, you're not going to put your cavity up here because you're going to get lots of rain in it. You're going to put your cavity on the bottom. And so using a cavity that was built by a woodpecker is usually going to have some advantages over a naturally formed cavity. Some of these species are wick excavators, like Carolina chickadees and tufted titmice, meaning that they can chip away and open up soft spots within the wood and form at least a small cavity, or they can rearrange a woodpecker cavity. Other cavity users would include things like bats, and we found tree frogs in some of our nest boxes before, lots of wasps and other types of insects and so forth. So our objective for this study was to look at cavity succession, which is basically who makes the cavity and then who uses it after that. And so we want to know the occupants of the cavities for the life of that particular excavation. To do that, we used an instrument called a Treetop Peeper, which is a really funny name, and it was fun to write grants to get the money to buy this piece of machinery. And basically what it is a fiber optic camera on a telescoping pole, which, as you can see in the picture, is graduated, so it'll also tell us the height of the cavity when we get it up there. We poke this probe that has the camera on it into the cavity, turn on some lights and turn on the camera, and we get an image down at the base of the pole, and it lets us look inside these cavities. Although if you look closely at the image on the monitor in this picture, we see that it's not actually in the cavity you're seeing down the pole. So we do this on a experimental farm at UT Martin that is made up of small woodlots and tree lines and surrounded by agricultural fields because it's the experiment station. And the fragmentation creates lots of edge, which is okay for red-bellied woodpeckers and flickers. Both of them will do okay in fragmented habitats, but it also opens them up to competition with European starlings. And European starlings are an introduced species that competes with them and takes or usurps their cavity from them from time to time. So that can be a problem. So in this picture, the arrow to the left is a snag, which is a tree that's usually dead and broken, that we watched a red-bellied woodpecker excavate a cavity in. And we were very excited. We got our peeper. It didn't have many branches in the way. You can see it's fairly short, so it was easy for us to get the camera into it. But we didn't have high hopes for it because the other arrow on the right, the taller tree, had starlings in it already. It had some old cavities and starlings had moved in. So we knew that the proximity of the new red-bellied cavity to the starling cavity was probably bad news. And so the starlings did move in. We know that the cavity was made by red-bellied woodpeckers because we watched them do it. But then we go to check it, and we know that the starlings took over the cavity. We saw them coming in and out. As you're looking at the picture in the bottom right of the slide, you can see the 4 starling eggs, and you can see there's some nesting material down below it. Woodpeckers do not put any nesting material in the cavity, just a few wood chips. So if you start seeing nesting material show up, you know it's no longer a woodpecker cavity, or they're not using that cavity. In this particular case, there was a late freeze, and unfortunately they're introduced, so I don't really care that much, but they froze to death and they never hatched, and so the starlings were unsuccessful. But we continued to watch the cavity, and in the summertime, some eastern bluebirds moved in. So the picture in the top left is a male bluebird, and you'll see that the starlings actually did some damage to the cavity and created a second opening, but that didn't seem to bother the bluebirds. And they laid 5 eggs. We were able to go in with a peeper and watch them until just before they were getting ready to leave. And we found that of the 5 eggs, 2 of them were likely fledged from the cavity. So we know, and then shortly after that, the cavity blew over in a storm. So we know the entire life of that cavity was made by a red-bellied woodpecker, usurped or stolen by European starlings, and then eastern bluebirds used it. And so what do we want to do with this type of information? Well, what we want to do is build something called a nest web. And so this is not our nest web. This is for a forest in the north, a boreal mixed wood nest web. But what it does is it makes connections between different species. So if you can see my cursor, I'm going to the kind of middle right. You can see pileated woodpecker. And then from the pileated woodpecker, if you look up, you can see that the cavities that they make are often used when they're done with them by things like wood ducks, mergansers, goldeneyes, saw-whits, and kestrels. Those type of connections can help us understand the importance of the woodpeckers in the ecosystem. And so we'd like to continue building links for our nest web and look at interactions between starlings and the woodpeckers to see what type of impact that has. You don't have to worry too much about the woodpeckers. When the starlings, they mostly compete with the starlings in the early spring, and then the starlings finish their breeding season. So what happens with the woodpeckers is they don't get to have their early start. They'll continuously try to re-nest, until the starlings are done. And then once the starlings are finished with their breeding season, the woodpeckers are then become more successful. So it's called delayed timing and reproduction, essentially. It's not the best situation, but at least we do still get woodpecker reproduction in these areas. And then we would like to see how much impact this actually has on the woodpecker biology. And so hopefully, y'all think of some things that live in cavities. I guess you can't really answer me.
Yes, they can. They can totally answer you in the chat.
Oh, okay.
Anybody want to share something that you've observed or something that you know that may be? Here we go. Paul is sharing. Hey, Paul. I see people I know. Carolina wrens. Perfect. Anybody else have something to share? Because I have a question regarding cavity nesters. Anybody else? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, here we go. Flying squirrel from Sandy Bivens. Hey, Sandy. Okay. So we've been, Screech Owl, I'm not going to be able to get in my question because people are answering your questions. Oh, Patsy, I knew Patsy would have to say something like that. Hey, Patsy, she says snakes. Yep. I think we might have a slide like that later. I can't remember. I wanted to ask, we're really kind of immersed in preparing for our purple, well, Laura might not call it that, preparing for purple martins. Would purple martins have used, say 100 years ago, woodpecker holes in the eastern United States? Because I know now they're 99% dependent on humans. So is that something that they would have used? Or is it more edge dependent species?
No, certainly. I want to say there's something else that purple martins used as well, but anything that uses a nest box would have used cavities in the past. And so people think about, one of the things I like to do when I'm doing programs is I'll hold up a nest box and I'll say, what is this? And somebody will say a nest box. And then I always say, no, it's an artificial cavity, because that's what it actually represents. But I don't remember what it is. They would have definitely used natural cavities and probably still use a few. But I feel like there is something else weird that purple martins did.
All right, we've got a question, or maybe, oh, it's not a question, it's an observation from my friend Melissa. Witnessed a red-breasted nuthatch excavate a nest, and chipmunks like flying at like cavities, and flying squirrels. So cool.
Yeah, cool. There's actually long lists. We can go on and on and on and on what uses cavities. Even amongst the birds, great crested flycatchers are cavity users, for example. Lots of different birds are. Okay, so we're ready. Let's go on. Okay, for the next one, I'm going to talk a little bit about how our different species that are present in the wintertime interact. And so one of the things you may not have thought about before, and you can think about as we're going through this presentation, is how do all these bark foragers live in the same forest? Like, if they're all doing the same thing, is that even possible? Is there enough food to go around? How are they going about doing that? So I'm going to give you a little bit of background, some basic ecology here. A niche is all.
We got one more question.
No problem.
We got one more question on the secondary succession. Do squirrels use woodpecker holes in natural situations as they do in the sides of wooden houses?
Absolutely. It's actually, flying squirrels are a big problem for red-cockaded woodpecker management. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah, pretty much anything that'll get in your nest box will also get in a natural cavity. Okay, so let's get back to niches and see if we can figure that out. So niches are all the aspects of an organism's environment that impacts them: where they live, what their predators are, what they eat, where they nest, do they migrate. All of these different aspects go into their biology, essentially. The niche breadth is the range of resources an organisms use, and some of them have really wide niches and some of them have very narrow niches. If they have a broad niche, they're referred to as a generalist. So on the slide, I've got a picture of a red-bellied woodpecker, and they're a great example of a habitat generalist. And so you can find them in the forest, you can find them in the city, you can find them in fragmented areas. They are very adaptable amongst the woodpeckers. On the bottom of the slide, I have a picture of a red-cockaded woodpecker, which has a very narrow niche breadth in that they only nest in pine trees that have a particular type of heart rot that allows them to excavate into the living tree. Now you might wonder why they excavate into living trees. It's because they make injuries around their cavity to stimulate the tree to leak resin, and then the resin helps keep snakes from climbing up the cavity and getting their babies and things. So they have a very different type of ecosystem or way that they do their niche than red bellies. I'm mostly going to talk a little bit about niche overlap. And niche overlap or resource overlap is going to be where two or more organisms share or compete for a particular resource. So a lot of these cavity nesting birds we were talking about in the previous project, that would be an example of niche overlap. They all need niches, they all need cavities in order to be successful. And that's a resource they have in common. But Gauss came up with this principle, the competitive exclusion principle, that says that no two species can have exactly the same niche and coexist. And so what that means is they can't use the environment in exactly the same way. They have to do something different. And that led to the concept of niche partitioning. So that's where you have species that alter the way that they use the environment to reduce competition, basically, between different species. The first person to look at this was a scientist named MacArthur. And the picture on this slide displays what he looked into. He was studying warblers, and notice that you could see several warblers feeding in the same tree, and he wondered how that was possible. Why is that possible if the competitive exclusion principle holds? And so he began to divide the tree up into different parts: the top of the tree, middle of the tree, edges of the tree, interior of the tree. And what he began to find out was, even though you might see several different warblers in the same tree, they were using different parts. And that allowed them to partition the resources and coexist. And so our goal was to look at niche breadth and niche overlap with our resident species that live in the bottomland hardwood forest in West Tennessee all year, to the migratory woodpeckers that are only there in the winter. And so our resident woodpeckers in the bottomlands in Northwest Tennessee are downy woodpeckers and red-bellied woodpeckers. Generally, downy woodpeckers are the smallest woodpecker we have in Tennessee, and they're going to feed on the smaller branches, and they're mostly insectivorous. Red-bellied woodpeckers, as I've already kind of mentioned, they are a generalist even in what they eat. They'll eat just about anything they can get a hold of. They'll steal it from somebody else. They really are a very generalized species. They're also my favorite species, by the way. Our migratory woodpeckers are red-headed woodpeckers and yellow-bellied sapsuckers. The yellow-bellied sapsuckers come from the north, so they have more of a true migration. But the females go further south, and the males are going to stay closer to their breeding range. So generally speaking, in Tennessee, you would expect to see mostly males during the winter time. Now, the red-headed woodpeckers are interesting because we really have two types of populations that get down into the bottomlands here in West Tennessee. We have the resident population that spends the summers in open areas, primarily doing fly catching, that move into the forest and switch to eating acorns in the winter. And then we have a portion of the population that moves from the north and gets pushed south into our bottomland. So we really have a mixed group, some that are Tennessee woodpeckers and some that have come from somewhere else. And so what we did is we observed them, and every 30 seconds we took a lot of measurements, like what were they doing? Were they on a living tree or a dead tree? Were they on the main branches or on the trunk, the little branches, vines? How high were they in the tree? Just trying to see what differences were going on between these species. And so the first two slides I have here just shows what they were doing for the most part. And so red-bellied woodpeckers were doing a lot of foraging, even though this is winter, still doing lots of squawking and communicating and being all loud. Vigilant means they were just kind of looking around. Downy woodpeckers were also spending a lot of their time foraging and communicating and hitching, kind of the same types of things the red-bellied woodpeckers were doing. When we go to our migratory woodpeckers, the red-headed woodpeckers spend a lot of time being vigilant. And we think that this might be because their behavior in the winter is to collect acorns and wedge them into crevices in dead limbs, and then they cover them with strips of bark, and that's called an acorn cache. And we think that they're probably, watching them, protecting them to some extent, especially from the red-bellied woodpeckers. And then when you look at yellow-bellied sapsuckers, they spend most of their time excavating sap wells. I'm going to talk a lot more about that as we go along.
Hey, Dawn, can you look at some of these specific behaviors in this pie chart, pie, and give us just a brief definition?
Okay.
Thank you.
Foraging, that's our favorite thing to do, especially if you like pie, I guess. That's feeding. Communication, they would either be calling or drumming. They do some other things too, like mutual tapping and some displays. Vigilant means they're just hanging out, looking around, and can't really tell that they're doing much of anything else for the most part. Hitching means they're moving up and down the tree. Preening is where they're cleaning and rearranging their feathers, restoring their flight surfaces. Well, excavation. I'm actually going to talk a lot about that a little bit later, but they're going to be excavating through the bark to get at the phloem tissue, which moves sap up and down the tree. I think did I get most of them? I think I got most of them. Okay, so don't worry about all the numbers on these slides. Mostly just look at our bar charts a little bit. This first one is looking at, were they feeding on something that is living or dead? So is the tree alive or is the tree dead? And you'll notice that red-headed woodpeckers, red-bellied woodpeckers, and downy woodpeckers both use living and dead surfaces. That's not real surprising. Even on a living tree, you're going to find ants and things running up and down the bark. But the yellow-bellied sapsucker spent almost all of their time on living trees, which goes along with their sap well excavation behavior that we saw in the previous slide. And then on this slide, the main thing I want to point out is that there was a lot of overlap in the parts of trees that were being used by red-headed woodpeckers and red-bellied woodpeckers. And in the course of our observations over a few years, that's also where we saw the most aggression, was between red-bellied and red-headed woodpeckers. They're about the same size, they're in the same genus, they're closely related, and their calls are also very similar, even though they have very different behaviors in the winter, with the red-headed woodpeckers caching acorns and the red-bellied woodpeckers likely trying to steal them. And so we think that yellow-bellied sapsuckers probably have minimal overlap with the other woodpeckers because of their sap well excavation. The downy woodpeckers likely minimize their overlap because they're using the smaller branches along the outside of the trees, vines, and things like that. And that the most overlap is probably going on between the red-headed woodpeckers and red-bellied woodpeckers, but we would like to look at that further. Specifically, one of the things we've done is look to see how red-headed woodpeckers are correlated with mast production or acorn production. We've done that for about 10 years, and if you have lots of acorns, you're going to have lots of red-headed woodpeckers. That's the bottom line in the bottomland hardwood forest in Tennessee. We want to compare red-bellied woodpecker niches in years when red-headed woodpeckers are present and when they're absent. But in the years that we've been looking at acorns, there's only been 1 year where we didn't have red-headed woodpeckers on site because we didn't have that much mast. We didn't have that many acorns for them to eat. And so if we're only going to get 1 year out of every 10 years, that's going to be very difficult to look at. And then just look at seasonal changes in niche use by these woodpeckers. And so hopefully through the discussion we've had here, maybe you can answer the question a little bit better. How can you have all these species living in the same forest doing what appears, at least superficially, to be doing the same thing?
Okay, we've got a question.
Okay.
My friend Melissa, and Melissa, I was thinking about Harry's the entire time, which doesn't sound right, but we're having a woodpecker discussion, so it's okay. I was thinking about Harry's the whole time that she was talking about this, because, you know, where did they fit into? So Melissa wants to know, do hairy woodpeckers fall into any category on these interactions or not? Are they not present there at all? Thank you, Melissa. Great question.
It is. And I actually, an hour before the presentation, I realized I have no hairy woodpecker picture. I was trying to squeeze one in and I couldn't find a good place to. Hairy woodpeckers are not very common here. I have one coming to the feeding station at my house right now. And so they are here. But you get excited when you see one because they're not very common. As far as size go, they're actually very similar in size to red-headed woodpeckers and red-bellied woodpeckers. But on our site during our study, if we did see any, it would have been maybe one over every few years. So not very common.
Since you brought that up, we actually had a question earlier and I answered it within the chat, but maybe you could talk about it for just a minute more. If I just have a headshot of a downy and a hairy, how am I telling the difference?
Okay. There's two things I look for. Well, if you have good scale, it's not that hard because they are so much larger in person. Like once you see one, it's not hard. But if you look at their bill, the downy bills are shorter compared to the width of their head. That's what they will often use in ornithology. Whereas in a hairy, the bill is longer than the width of the head. But also the downy has a lot more feathers around its nostrils, which is where it gets its name downy from, than the hairy woodpecker does. And once you see that, it's also kind of obvious. But if you start looking at the downy, they have a lot of feathers just kind of right here, and their bill is short. Okay, so I'm gonna talk to you about one more thing. This one's gonna seem a little weird in some ways. And the title here might even be a little bit more technical, but basically, we are interested in the bacteria that live in the guts of sapsuckers, and are they able to break down something called cellulose? I'm going to talk about that as we go along the slides. And so as you're thinking about this project, I would like you to think about, do you know of any birds that feed kind of like a cow or a deer? In other words, they're eating plant material, but not really your seed feeders, like not the birds coming to your feeders at your houses eating sunflower seeds. Like, is there anything that eats like that? Because that's basically what a sapsucker is doing. It's browsing. And so this first slide is very similar to what we've already seen. This project, at least the beginning of it, took place in Mississippi. So this is what I found the yellow-bellied sapsuckers doing in Mississippi. They spend a lot of time working on these sap wells. And so when I say sap foraging here, they're excavating and working on these sap wells, maintaining them, just hanging out around them, all of that. And so why are they spending so much time doing that? All right. And so the picture on the right here is showing you some sap wells. And you may have seen this type of damage before. Sometimes people think that it's insect damage, but it's not. It's a woodpecker that's doing this. And what they're doing is they are excavating through the bark, and they're trying to get to the phloem. And the phloem is the tissue that transports sugars from the crown of the tree to wherever it needs to go. So with this, well, in the fall, that would normally be from the crown down to the roots where it's stored. Now the top, I have a picture of a tree for going through the 4 different seasons. And I wanted to point out that during the winter time, our trees are dormant, which means that they don't have leaves on them. And so they're not doing photosynthesis. And the phloem is not transporting sugars up and down. And this causes a little bit of a conundrum, because in the summertime, when a sapsucker is excavating into a tree, it leaks sap, so much so that hummingbirds will come and feed at them, insects come and feed at them, squirrels will come and feed at them. But in the wintertime, they look like this picture. They look pretty much dry. And so what are these birds doing? And why are they spending so much time doing it? And specifically started to ask, are they really after sap in the winter when there's really no discernible sap flow in the trees? And to think about this, we began to talk a little bit about cellulose when I was doing my research. And so here's a little bit about it. It is a polysaccharide made up of glucose monomers. That's all fancy, sciencey talk, but it just means glucose is a sugar. And you just take a bunch of glucoses and you link them together, and that's what makes up cellulose. It is what reinforces cell walls in plants and other types of plant fibers. And in terms of our diet, that's what we know it as. We know it as fiber, and it helps keep you regular. Cellulose, essentially, when you eat it, passes through your body, and you do not digest it in any way. We don't have that capability. And that gets to the last bullet on this slide, and that is that cellulose is indigestible by vertebrates without some type of mutualist, like a bacteria, a protozoan, or a fungi. And in particular, we were interested in bacteria that are capable of breaking down cellulose. And so I started looking in the literature, and I did find that some researchers in the past that had looked at the contents of the gut of sapsuckers had found some, with a lot of times, this was in the 1930s, they would say cambium, but essentially phloem tissue. And so we opened up some woodpeckers that had been collected. Usually these had flown into windows or things like that. And we looked at 2 different parts of their digestive tract. We took a sample from their stomach and one from their intestines. And we found that the chunks of cellulose in their stomach were huge. That's the top picture. Whereas the chunks of cellulose lower down in the intestines were much smaller, which doesn't tell us anything about bacterial degradation, but it does tell us at least that they are consuming cellulose. They are consuming, plant material, and it is getting pulverized as it goes through their digestive tract. And so if you look at a sapsucker and you think about it, if they were just eating sap and the sap's not flowing, and so as part of my dissertation, I went out and measured how much sugar was in this tissue, free sugar, not cellulose, just free sugar. How much tissue would they have to eat if that's all they could digest? If they could just digest the digestible sugar parts and not the cellulose, they would have to eat 2,079 grams of phloem tissue per day, which doesn't seem very realistic for a bird that weighs 45.5 grams. But if they do have symbionts and they are able to break apart cellulose, they'd only have to eat about 8.8 grams, which is a lot more reasonable. And so when I got my job at UT Martin, somehow I convinced a microbiologist to begin to help me look at the bacteria in the gut of sapsuckers. And to get us started, we needed to have an assay that would detect cellulitic activity. And it's a very simple assay. It's not all that simple to put together, but it is simple to understand. And we have these Petri dishes. We smear bacteria on them. The only food source in the Petri dish for them is cellulose. And so if they can't break down cellulose, they can't grow in the Petri dish. And when we stain it, it just looks like this. But if we smear it with bacteria and they can break down cellulose, and then we stain the plate, it looks like this. It turns a little pinkish. And so once we were able to get this assay working so that we knew that when cellulose was broken down, we could detect it, we decided to test it out with some termites. And so I just went out to a log and kicked it open, grabbed some termites. We smushed up their guts and we put them onto Petri dishes and used our method, and we found cellulitic bacteria. And so you can see that some of the bacteria that we cultured, like up here, it's labeled H2. Doesn't look like there's anything there that's able to digest cellulose. But right here, look how good this one can. This smear of bacteria are very healthy, this little colony. And you can see that area around them is pink, so they're digesting cellulose. So one day, I got a phone call that a yellow-bellied sapsucker had flown into a window at the library. And I went over and got it in time to bring it back and sample the lower digestive tract. In the future, we'd like to sample different parts along the digestive tract, but this was, a last-minute thing. We just put a swab up through the rear end of the woodpecker and then rubbed it all over the plate just to see if we could detect any cellulitic bacteria. And we found at least 5 strains of bacteria capable of digesting cellulose. So we were super excited, and we're working with those 5 strains, trying to get them identified right now. Now, just to summarize what we have going on, we do know that there are cellulose-degrading bacteria present, but we don't know how they're contributing to the overall diet of yellow-bellied sapsuckers. But we do know that they spend a lot of time foraging on trees that don't have sap flowing through them, which is really odd. Okay, so did y'all think of any birds that primarily feed on things that would be high in cellulose? I'm going to tell you my favorite one. My favorite one's the Hoatzin. Has anybody ever know what a Hoatzin is? They live in.
Spell that in the chat.
What now?
You might have to spell that in the chat.
In the chat? Let's see, I can do that. Let's see. Chat. Oh, let's see if I can. Hoatzin. I believe that's right. The Hoatzin lives in South America. I saw them in Brazil, and they're really cool. When they're babies, they still have claws on their wings, then claw up the trees, and they feed primarily on leaves, and they have a big fermentation point, much like a cow might have, and digest leaves. There's very few birds that do that, though, and so this is a little unusual. Some of your grouse can do it. Grouse eat a lot of needles and things like that. Pine needles, sage, things like that that are difficult to digest. And they also have fermentation points. We think that not very many birds do that though, because it's heavy. It's heavy to carry around that material while it's being broken down by bacteria. That's why we don't think we see it very often. So we don't really know how all this fits together yet. While y'all are thinking about questions, I'm going to put up my last slide. Let's see.
I did have a couple of questions, which I'm sure that you know we would have had about when you have like a tulip poplar tree or a maple tree with that much quote unquote woodpecker damage on it, does it injure the tree?
Okay. Yeah, it certainly does injure the tree. However, there have been several studies that have shown that they are not generally going to be feeding on a healthy tree. So it's likely the tree was already infected with a fungus or something like that, because plants, just like animals, have immune responses. And so when they get something like a fungus infection, that will often elevate their sugar, the sugar content in their tissues, and that's going to make it a more delicious thing for them to eat, essentially. And so don't blame it all on the woodpecker anyway.
We've got a lot of questions coming in, Dawn. Are you ready?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Can we stop sharing your screen and we can see you? And Roger just shared, I saw 2 pileated woodpeckers moving horizontally in both directions about 3 feet from the ground for about 2 minutes. A third pileated woodpecker tried to join them and the original 2 flew away. What observations do you have?
What time of year was it?
Ooh, Roger, let us know time of year.
Because I say that, yeah, because it could be a young one. They could be pairing. There's a lot of things that could be happening. They stay with the, woodpeckers will take care of their babies once they fledge for the cavity for a certain amount of time, kind of varies a little bit, but eventually they'll get tired of them hanging around and kick them out. Quit feeding them and things like that.
He says 3 weeks ago.
3 weeks ago? Yeah, that's hard to say. Right now the woodpeckers are pairing. I'm starting to hear a lot more drumming. They shouldn't really have cavities that are going to be used for nesting until April. So it's a little bit early, but they're definitely starting some breeding activities right now.
We're getting questions all over the board here too, so just be ready. My friend Melissa wants to know, Hoatzins have claws at birth. Do not hatch
when they hatch. Mm-hmm.
Do not hatch have those.
Do nuthatches? No, as far as I know, nothing else. I'm not talking about claws on their toes. I'm talking about on their wings.
Yeah, that's what she said, on their feathers.
Yeah. No, not as far as I know. Watsons are the only ones that still do that. That still have those. No normal Tennessee birds. That was weird tropical bird. That's more like, dinosaur type thing. Like Archaeopteryx would have had that characteristic, for example.
I love it that you live in a cabin. I bet you have lots of woodpecker activity.
Yes, this property is known as Woodpecker Woods.
I shared Melissa's question to you, her comment to you, incorrectly. She was actually asking, do nuthatches have this cellulose digesting business
bacteria
going on too?
The reality is that the ability to look at the microflora, that's the bacteria that live in the gut of sapsuckers, is relatively new. A lot of it is done, we did it culturing, and we only found 5 species. But I had another student that you go in, and instead of culturing it or rubbing it on a petri dish like we did, you actually just extract the DNA and you sequence it. And you can find a lot more different species doing that. And it's opened up a lot of new areas in environmental microbiology, and there's a lot that's really unknown. So the bacteria in the guts of birds is best studied in things like turkey, quail, things that have some type of economic importance to us, and not so much in wild birds, because it wasn't just all that easy to do, if that makes sense. It's also anaerobic. We did this facultative anaerobes in our study because we don't have truly anaerobic equipment to do it. And so you can get anaerobic bacteria by extracting their DNA. And, like I said, that's a relatively new thing to do. That's a roundabout way of saying I don't know. But if some of you are interested in that, then maybe you understood what I said.
Of the 3 studies that you've shared just now, which was your favorite to conduct? And which one do you wish that you could immerse yourself in again and just really take off with?
I think I've done a lot of niche work. So I did a lot of that for my PhD. But the one I'm really interested in nest webs. They've done some really interesting stuff with them up north. So you saw that nest web for the mixed boreal forest. We haven't done anything like that in the US. That was Canada. And so I think it would be really informative to understand better how our forests work. We already know that woodpeckers are keystone species because they provide cavities for other species. And so if you took woodpeckers out of the ecosystem, you would lose or at least greatly reduce the number of other cavity nesting species. But we don't necessarily know all the different interactions, what trees are contributing to that and all that kind of stuff. But that's difficult to do because breeding season is same time as finals weeks. And so for whatever reason, the students aren't as willing to go out all day during finals week.
Dawn, thank you. Laura, thank you for staying late and making this program possible. It's a partnership through Friends of Warner Parks, our nonprofit, Warner Park Nature Center, and Metro Parks of Nashville, Davidson County. Guys, visit our website, check out our bird programs. We've got all kinds of great stuff going on here all the time. Dawn, I hope to see you soon.